Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun one because I've sort of had bits of traveling and bits of moving around, and so my sort of reading always ends up becoming a bit sort of odd when that happens, because I either have really intense bits of walking around with an audiobook or kind of being on a long train journey with a book, or I have almost the opposite where I'm doing anything else apart from reading. Luckily this one involved a fair bit of reading, so let's get talking a little bit about it here today. So first up, and this one feels almost a little bit like cheating because I read this book a while ago, but while I was away, my physical copy showed up, and that is Queer as Folklore by Sacha. And I've been following him online for a while because he has these really interesting takes on myths and fairy tales and folklore and all these other things, and he's really interesting with it. But particularly, I think what I then found interesting from the book is how he sort of weaves that into a bigger narrative. So a big part of this book really looks at the various sort of tropes and ideas and recurring themes that appear in myths and fairy tales and folklore and all these other things, and how there are some specific parts that seem that the LGBTQIA plus community sort of leans more towards, even if they're not explicitly queer things. So, for example, tropes around mermaids or tropes around various other kind of mythical figures like unicorns. There's often a way that people in the queer community can see something of themselves in those things. So even if they're not explicitly a kind of queer thing, if they are a thing that's about the outsider or a kind of a misunderstood person or whatever, naturally marginalized communities rally behind them in the same way that the comics like X-Men, although purportedly about one thing, this sort of race of mutants, often had many other people from the queer community, from sort of racially marginalized communities, all sort of see parts of themselves in the experiences and the stories of those. And so I think what Sacha does really well here is draw a real line through some of those parts. So looking at the better known stories, so the kind of Hans Christian Andersen kind of mermaid thing that kind of keeps coming up in various parts of his stories, but also and kind of how that is potentially a kind of an allegory for him wanting to be with someone who would never love him back. But then also these other things about looking at kind of modern day things of horror films or sci-fi, and the way that those maybe use tropes around aliens or body horror to also talk about a specific type of unease that is also felt by certain communities. So I think this book is really interesting and really beautiful in many ways, and I'm glad to finally have my physical copy so I can kind of talk about it a little bit more. Plus it also has a very cute hand-drawn design there as well. So yeah, very cute book, and one I really highly recommend. It's just a really beautiful read, really heartfelt read, but also just very fun and very yeah, just really interesting. Next up, a book I started reading as part of well, partly because I'd kind of wanted to read it for a little while anyway, and a few people told me I really should, but also in my kind of project to read other books by the shortlisted authors from this year's Booker. And I'd heard a lot about Hisham Matar's book, The Return, and I was glad to finally read it. So this is a really interesting and really beautiful book, and if you've read My Friends, the book that he was longlisted for this year's Booker, then actually a lot of this book will feel very familiar, because actually a lot of what appears in The Return, you can see a through line into how he used it for My Friends, or kind of similar themes or similar ideas. So in The Return, this is a non-fiction book with Hisham Matar talking about his family, and particularly his father. So his father is a sort of fairly known figure, at least within sort of political systems and structures and all of these sorts of things. And he goes missing and is believed to have been basically, to some degree, either intentionally disappeared by authorities, or to to be somewhere else. And so a large part of this book is Hisham Matar trying to understand his own family and what that means. He's just emerging. He's about to release his first book, sort of a part of this book itself. So he's sort of talking about that process of becoming better known initially for his father going missing, and then being ready to release a book, and then it becoming this weird thing of in some ways, the power he gets by being a published author allows him a little bit of extra power to raise the profile of this case. But equally, there's a kind of a feeling that he has that it's almost not enough, that he's, you know, what is he doing with his life? He's sat there writing and doing all these things. Couldn't he be doing more? And yeah, this book I just think is a really interesting way of him talking about some really atrocious things that nobody really should ever have to go through. And the kind of odd peace he makes early on, because he almost has to acknowledge that his father will never come back, but he also has to have the hope that his father will return, and trying to hold on to those two things, this sense of hope, but also a kind of realism that gives him closure, is a really difficult place for him to be in. I just think this is a really well written and really, really beautiful piece of writing, albeit one that talks about some really tough and difficult things. Next up, I read My Dream Job by Norman Erikson Pasaribu. And you may recognise his name from Happy Stories Mostly, which was on the Booker long list, International Booker long list a few years ago, won the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and was just this really, really interesting set of short stories. And in many ways, the kind of odd, sort of odd-beat kind of tone of that is very much seen in this poetry collection as well. And it's a really interesting set of poems because at times it feels like it's intentionally trying not to be understood. There are poems, for example, that are in other languages other than English, and there is something quite challenging about that, of him sort of saying, kind of deal with it, right? But then there are these other parts where he sort of is writing about kind of a bit of everything, really, a bit of love and loss, a bit of sort of queer identity, a bit of a sort of a little bit else. And I just think there's something so fascinating about the way this does it. It isn't trying to, it's almost like it's resisting trying to be liked in a more traditional sense. It is a book that is just sort of, is very invested in telling its story, its stories, I guess, and particularly kind of the kind of moments of what it means to be a kind of an other. And so they write in this book about, for example, wanting to, you know, sort of seeing these men who like the author, but also seem to be sort of fetishizing him for being Indonesian, and these are particularly Dutch men, and so there's a kind of colonized angle to it and all these other things. Yeah, a really interesting book. And I mean, a big part of also why I wanted to include it in this wrap up is Tilted Axis, the press who published this, are sort of in some sort of basically need some sort of financial support as well. So I'll put a link in the bit below this this video, but if you do feel able to support them, they are a really interesting press. As you can see from, I'm not sure how this angle works. If you can see there, just behind me, that little row there is Tilted Axis books. They are really beautiful books. They're really interesting books, and they are intentionally publishing translated work from books from authors from countries that often don't get as translated, and particularly from languages that aren't as translated. So just over there somewhere, I think there's a book from sort of originally in Kazakh, one from Uzbek, a few other languages that are very rarely translated, even including as well Gitanjali Shree's amazing book that won the International Booker a couple of years ago, translated as well. And it's Tomb of Sand. I don't know why I forgot the name there for a second. Translated by Daisy Rockwell. And they have just been really pumping out some incredible books, and I really do urge you, if you feel able to support them, to do so. Next up, and with oddly similar themes actually, The Centre by Ayesha, Manazir, Siddiqi. And this is a book that I think is so wild and took me completely by surprise, because I'd sort of heard about it, but I hadn't really thought to look into it. And then I kind of checked it out, and it's a book that takes as its core idea, there's a sort of a centre you can go to learn a language fluently in 10 days. And the core premise of this, you know, starts as this kind of, it's too good to be true, but there are kind of interesting dynamics that come from it. So for example, at the beginning of the book, we are introduced to our main character. She is frustrated that she can't speak as much Urdu as she was raised with, and she's sort of losing it, and she feels like she's sort of trying to teach herself more of it, and all of these things. And her husband, out of nowhere, just emerges being able to speak it fluently. He's a white English man who has never previously studied it, and he is able to talk to her parents in fluent Urdu. And this is embarrassing for her, not only because she can't necessarily keep up, but because this seems to also change the sort of dynamic that suddenly they are looking at their daughter saying, why can't you be more like your husband? And, you know, these other things. But the book also brings in these really interesting dynamics around race and culture, and kind of the sort of dynamics that come from what languages are seen as good to be translated and not good, or, you know, like what's going to sell, and all these sorts of things. And also what are the languages that are seen as being popular and fun and like have a kind of cultural cachet, right? So the our main character is a translator, and so she talks quite a lot about really wishing that she could read Russian or German, not only because those are books that, you know, where there's a lot of literature to translate and there's a kind of cultural cachet attached to it, but also for herself and the cultural cachet of it, to be able to feel like, oh yes, well, I read that in the original Russian and that makes me sophisticated and intellectual and all these other things. And without spoiling how this book sort of ends, obviously we know that there's something too good to be true about this way of learning, this kind of 10 days of becoming fully fluent. And the book becomes really unnerving once you start realizing some of the things that are happening. And there's a real tension to it, where we also start to, I think, see the main character as being this very tricky character, because she sort of is trying to work out what's happening, but is also completely conflicted in so many other parts of her life. I thought this was really gripping and really interesting. A very wild book, but I'd really recommend giving it a shot. I think it's a really interesting book. And last but not least, Vanessa Kisuule with Neverland, The Pleasures and Perils of Fandom. And I really loved this. I thought this was so well done. I think this is an exceptional piece of writing, and I'm almost annoyed that this is a debut piece of nonfiction from her, because partly because I want to read more, and also because she's so good right out the gate. So this is a book, as the kind of title might hint, in many ways about Michael Jackson. And the book is fascinating, I think, for how it approaches its subject matter. So it takes as the core idea what it means to be a fan of somebody who later turns out to be this sort of problematic figure in some ways. So she talks about her childhood and being a massive fan of Michael Jackson, becoming absolutely obsessed with him. And then when these allegations come up about, you know, everything that happened at the Neverland ranch, she starts to really find it difficult to know how to feel, because on one hand, she is very much of the opinion, you know, you should believe victims or survivors when they speak up. But equally, this news is a real sort of shake to the foundations of who she is in some ways. You know, she's always been a fan of Michael Jackson, and how do you square that off? And in doing so, she then opens up this much broader conversation about liking problematic artists, what it really means, the sort of idea of being cancelled or anything like that, and how you can approach a sort of someone's work, and whether it is ever possible to sort of distance the artist and the art. But she goes a lot deeper than I think many other books or articles go on this. I think typically when people talk about it, they sort of stop there and it becomes a very limited conversation about it. But she then uses this to go into talking about the machinations of the industry that also have vested interests in various parts of this. So how both media and music industry execs and various other people will be complicit or not in various parts of this behavior. She talks, for example, also about looking back differently at other parts of her childhood. So at one point, you know, being obsessed with Britney Spears' first album, and then when she looks back at the cover of the first album, she's almost embarrassed because it's a sort of teenage Britney, you know, sat kind of on the floor, kind of just on her knees in a schoolgirl uniform, looking very, or kind of a very like very teen, sort of very young outfit. But the kind of styling of the the record is also meant to have an air of sexuality and of various other things. And so she basically looks back over her life and starts readdressing so many of these things through the lens of what it would be if it were happening now. And so many interesting things spark off of this, I think. It's just a really in-depth and thought-through book. And like I said, I've read some books before, or articles or whatever, that have been about this topic, and I don't think they approach it in anywhere near as much with anywhere near as much intrigue as this author does. I think there's something really special about the way that she is sort of like, yeah, so now we've established that this is a thing, let's go and think about this other thing here. And it feels very current and very fresh, and I'm so excited for anything else she writes, because I think this is a really, really brilliant piece of writing. And so those are the books I've read this week. I hope you're keeping really well, and I hope you're having a good week. I shall speak to you all soon. I'll also be on holiday again, again at some point soon. So there'll be some videos that are sort of scheduled while I'm away. You'll barely know that I've gone, but I hope everyone's keeping well and that you're able to stay good and happy, even as, at least in the UK, it's starting to get a little darker, a little colder and wetter. But anyway, there we go. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.